Start again. Microphone was turned off.
Yeah.
Welcome everybody to our 40th Open Clock Club. And my name's Matthew Reed, and this is a How to Repair Pendulum Clocks production. Open Clock Club is primarily designed for beginners, and so if you're new to our event, then a very, very warm welcome. If you came through our Facebook group, which I think is called How to Repair Pendulum Clocks, went over 900 members this week. So that's becoming kind of quite a formidable animal in its own right. But anyway, so the usual caveats here, this session is recorded. If I've pressed the recording button, which I always have to check. Yeah, there it is, flashing away. And so it goes on to our archive, the Open Clock Club archive, which is a YouTube channel. So if you are new and you want to pick up on previous events, then they're all up there. So if you want to remain anonymous, then please keep your camera turned off. Otherwise, as I said, Facebook's been super busy all week. A massive thank you to those people who attend and contribute to that in a very kind of positive and supportive way to get beginners started. So here on our Open Clock Club, we've been through quite a lot over the months, the last 9 months or so. And over the past few weeks, in fact, probably the past 6 weeks or something now, I've kind of lost track, we've been looking at fusee-driven clocks. So last week, we finally got our chain-driven fusee clock together. So if you want to see that again, look at last week's recording. And we'll come back to that in a minute. Well, not in a minute, but at the end of this session. And in the meantime, we were faced with a problem that most people find very early on in their horological career. And we get this on the Facebook group the whole time, is either the suspension spring is broken or missing on my clock. Now, with so the suspension spring, for those people who are new here, is the bit of material that connects the pendulum, and not always, but in 99% of clocks, it connects the pendulum, and here is our pendulum rod. I've taken the pendulum bob off, the weight at the bottom, to, in this case, the movement via this device, which is called the back cock, and the suspension spring engages with the back cock and the pendulum swings backwards and forwards. As you can see, this piece of material is quite fragile, typically, let's say about 0.1, 0.1215 millimeter thick. So it easily gets damaged, particularly if you move the clock or transport it and you don't remove the pendulum. Okay, now in this case, slightly, little bit more complicated, because if you saw the run-up to this and the stuff that we put on Facebook, we are zoomed in as much as we can get. The top of the pendulum where the suspension spring fits, there was a pin through here that was riveted in place, and it was like really difficult to get it out. So I've actually worked on this offline to drill out the pin. And what I had to do was I had to drill from both sides with my Archimedean drill, which is here, really useful thing to have. Could just use a regular drill or a bench press drill if you've got one. And I drilled out the rivet. I actually managed to drill right through the middle. I was very happy about that. So I've mentioned this many times, don't rivet that pin. In fact, you don't rivet it. It just doesn't need it. If the pin that holds this on is a good fit and it's draw filed, it just needs to be pushed in. It won't work its way out of the hole. Okay, I did wonder whether this had been soldered. I don't know whether you can see there's some corrosion here. In fact, I'm pretty sure it has at some time. And this is the leftover flux, which has caused it to corrode. And also you can see the spring has broken, but it's actually rusted through. So anyway, so I got the pin out offline because it took me quite a long time. I'll just get a pair of pliers and get this out of here. I haven't actually try doing this. There we are. So this butt end of the spring is out. Now, what we could do in terms of the thickness of the spring, because again, this is, let's get that to focus. This is one of those very frequent questions. Once the spring has disappeared, or let's say you buy a clock that doesn't even have a suspension spring, how do you know how long it's going to be or needs to be, and how do you know how thick it needs to be? That's a really important point here. And we have covered this before, but I think it's useful because we see this question crop up on Facebook the whole time. So in this case, the length is kind of predetermined as it is on most clocks, because when we look at the this is the assembly of the pallets that engage with the escape wheel, the pallet arbor, and the crutch, which I think some people call the leader here, and the crutch pin. Now, as a rule of thumb, don't build your practice on rules of thumb, he says, we could take it that crutch pin fits halfway, I'll just move it around like this, halfway down that crutch slot. That would be a kind of logical place to begin. So that's one bit of evidence. The other bit of evidence we can look for is we can get an eyeglass or low power magnification. Our pointy stick too, pointy stick. And we can look on the inside of the crutch slot here for a wear mark. Now, you will be able to see a wear mark, but of course you can't take it 100% that is where the crutch pin was. Right. Not surprisingly, there are actually 3 wear marks here. There's one pretty much in the middle. There's one about 2/3 of the way up, and there's quite a heavy one about 2/3 of the way down. So that kind of doesn't help. It tells us, which is not a surprise, a clock that's 100 years old. It tells us that the suspension spring on this clock has been changed. Now, we can look at, if I can find it, the pendulum bob. Can't be far, this is. Anyway, we can look at the pendulum bob because it's kind of, or it was kind of practice with clockmakers. I don't think anybody does it anymore. That when you get a clock in for cleaning and you're going to completely disassemble it, then you scratch a mark. I'm not asking you to do this or telling you to do this, but I'm asking you not to do it at the top of the pendulum bob so you know where it goes back on the slide here. This is bent, as you can see. We'll straighten it up later. And if we get this in some reflected light, there's our light, there we go. You can see, as predicted, there's a mark here, and then there's a mark there as well. So 2 distinct positions where the pendulum bob has been. I might pop off in a second and find the pendulum bob. It's not far. Just a second. So here it is. I'm not wearing my gloves today, which I should be doing my nitrile gloves to prevent fingerprinting. Anyway, this needs straightening up. Let's just have a little bend there. Okay, so let's put our pendulum bob on. Right, there's another thing here as well. This is all great evidence, and this is one of my sort of supporting bits of advice for not refinishing clocks, is it's easy to lose this evidence. So there are 2 scratch marks on this side. So if we put the bob on, we can see it slides up that way. Is this reversible would be my first question. Doesn't go on as far that way. So I would say that it's meant to fit on that way, which is where the 2 marks are. Can't really see anything on that side. Okay, so the pendulum has been in 2 positions, or the pendulum bob's been in 2 positions. So building up evidence for this whole question of how long is the suspension spring, the next thing I would say was, logically, where would the rating nut be when the clock was made? If you were making this clock, you obviously wouldn't put the rating nut right down at the bottom or right up near the top. You'd kind of put it maybe a third of the way up or something, so the clock could be regulated. So let's just dig back in the box and find the rating nut. Right.
When do you replace the suspension spring, or what's the best time that they might need replacing soon?
I think it's a good question. So the question is, when do you replace the suspension spring? And I think with a steel spring on a clock like this, the vast majority of clocks that we make have got like regular sort of carbon steel suspensions, only when it's actually showing signs of damage. And that damage only occurs, you know, in terms of creasing and cracking in the hands of people. You put the pendulum on, and as long as the spring doesn't rust, it's got effectively an infinite number of cycles as far as we're concerned. It doesn't reach its elastic limit, and therefore, as long as it doesn't rust, and that's the big question. And I would say I wouldn't preemptively replace a spring unless it was rusty. And even on a domestic clock, if it was a bit rusty, I wouldn't care about that. The only time I would replace a spring if it was showing signs of rust would be on a turret clock. And I don't repair turret clocks anyway. And it would be interesting to ask a turret clock specialist this question, because of course you don't want the pendulum dropping when it weighs 300 weight and it's going to kill somebody or damage the building or damage itself. On a domestic clock, unless it's actually cracked, cracking, or really badly rusted, I would leave it alone. Under normal circumstances, it lasts effectively an infinite number of vibrations. Oh, I've got some nice sunlight somewhere coming up through the bench, which is a bit crazy. Anyway, so here's our rating nut. So let's pop the nut on. And
it says, how about a slight bend?
A bend in what? Oh, the spring. If it's a bend and not a crease, I would leave it. Unless you think like this, if you look at this spring here, you know, when we're doing this stuff, we think about kind of value, really. Come on, focus. Thank you. And when we look at this, the hole is punched way off center anyway. So I don't see a massive amount of value in this. But if the spring is a bit curved when you take it off, as long as it does its job, I think sometimes they get twisted. And if you imagine a suspension spring, it has to be the same length at both sides. It can't be, it must be planar, I suppose I'm saying. It shouldn't be curved as in a compound curve, because when the pendulum swings, then it'll wobble. It won't swing in a clean arc. So that would be another sign that it would need replacing. In fact, that reminds me that hopefully we'll get this finished this week. Well, we will get it finished this week. I'll do it offline if necessary. That reminds me that on the Facebook group page, there's a questionnaire of your top 10 faults that you find with clocks. And one of them I put down is the pendulum weaving, you know, not swinging in a straight arc, which is sometimes or often caused by a kinked suspension spring. I tend to not go looking for trouble. Clocks are kind of bad enough as they are, you know, just taking them apart, putting them back together again is kind of enough. So I don't be too preemptive about thinking, well, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 years down the line, this disaster scenario could happen.
Derek says, if you haven't got any telltale marks, how do you determine the spring length?
Right, okay, so back to the spring length. Thank you, Derek. I'm gone off piece there. So we look at this, the slot in the pendulum. We look at marks on the top block in case of a long case clock. And then, so you made this clock, okay, where are you going to put the rating? No, you're not going to put it all the way up here with all this rating thread sticking out. That would look kind of crazy. And you can see here, look, there's been a bit of a, see that mark? So it's been there relatively recently. So about well, not quite half, not quite a third way up, which is okay. And that coincides with the lower mark is there. So zoom out a little bit. That kind of looks okay to me. So I'm reasonably happy that that little mark there is, we're kind of in the ballpark. Okay. Of course, we don't know. We can work out through our train count. On Facebook, I think a while ago, we talked about train count, which is counting the number of gears in the clock. We can work out the effective length of the pendulum, which is really great. And it's very useful exercise, but it doesn't really help us here because the effective length and the actual working length are rather different things in a clock like this. So the only way you can tell whether you've got the spring the correct length is by making one based on this evidence that we've just looked at and then seeing how it goes. Obviously, if you make a spring, and I know you know what I'm going to say next, don't you? First person to anticipate what I'm going to say next gets a special prize that doesn't exist. They're the best special prizes, aren't they? So come on, Wolfie, what am I going to say next? And Jane. So obviously, if you've made your spring and the clock only keeps time when the rating thread's right down here, then that's a problem because your client isn't going to be able to rate the clock. It's going to the pendulum's going to fall off. And the same thing if it was all the way up here as well. There's obviously something wrong. So you're kind of aiming towards that ballpark. So you can start, you can make a spring. And remember, if you make a spring and you make it a bit long, you can always shorten it. However, with a clock like this, you've got a case at the bottom and it's quite close to the bottom of the pendulum. So you are restricted in how long that spring can be. So if the pendulum's really near the case, then you've got to think, oh, wait a minute, there's some problem here. And that leads me around to what am I going to say next in terms of pendulum, suspension spring, length and strength.
Wolfie says, make sure to run the clock on a test stand. Check.
Being cheeky. Has nobody got it?
No.
Oh dear. Right. Okay. So the key thing is we've been obsessing about the length of the spring for the last 20 minutes, but actually there's another major factor, and that's the thickness of the spring. Oh, thank you, Wolfie. Just sneaked in there under the line. Right. Okay. So I've talked a lot about this in relation to mainsprings. And this is why I'm obsessed with not replacing mainsprings, because if we take a spring, here's a spring, it's X long, it's Y thick, and it's Z wide or something like that. Anyway, 3 dimensions for a given alloy of material. Remember, the alloy of the material, the steel and the hardening and tempering can also be quite radically different, which will affect the spring force, spring rate, and therefore the timekeeping of the clock. When you've got your pendulum here swinging like this, let's say this top bit is fixed as it is in this clock. We talked a second ago about the effective length of the pendulum. You can work that out from the train count, and the actual length being a separate thing. That is based on something called a simple pendulum in physics. What we've got is a much more complicated picture here because we've got God and gravity, and we did a little experiment, didn't we, a few months ago, who's got the most gravity? And anyway, that was cool, different story. We've got gravity, but we've also got the restoring force of the spring, what Harrison called artificial gravity. Got no idea where that sunlight's coming from. Crazy, can't figure it out. Anyway, oh, I see. Oh, that's nice. It's actually reflecting off a French clock movement. That's why it's such lovely light. I'll leave it because the sun will move around. Or we'll rotate, one of those two. Anyway, so you've got the gravity, which is pretty much fixed as far as we're concerned anyway. But you've also got the restoring force of the spring. So when the spring is deflected to one side, it wants to return to the center. So that's an accelerating force on the spring. So it's effectively adding to gravity, if you like to put it kind of simply. And then the problem is that if we take the width of the spring let's say slightly crazily, we doubled the width of the spring. That's kind of quite easy because we double the strength of the spring and the restoring force. But when we come to the thickness, this is much more sort of complicated, not complicated, but important, because the strength of the spring is proportional to the cube of the thickness. So if you change the thickness a bit, then you're going to change that restoring force a lot. And this, you might think, wow, that's not going to make a difference. It makes a big difference. And the same thing for the length as well. That's also a cube law. So here's your test. Get ready on the buzzers, everybody at home. If we fit a spring that is thicker, what is going to happen to the rate of our clock? Is it going to run faster or is it going to run slower? So I'll give you 10 seconds, faster or slower?
She says faster.
Anybody else? Just to check that everybody's not completely asleep.
Adam says faster.
Right, it's faster.
Cheryl says faster.
You're right. And the thing is that little bit of difference makes a big difference. And you see this often in these type of fusee clocks where somebody's fitted a spring that's too thick. They've used a bit of clock mainspring or something, or watch mainspring, and they've regulated the clock and they've taken it down and down and down, and it's right down at the bottom of the case and they can't regulate it any further. That's because the spring is too thick. Okay, so quite a sort of complicated picture in a sense. So all you can do is you can experiment, and if you get outside the range of this evidence, then you know something's wrong. So I'm aiming to rate this clock so it's about near that mark, about that much rating thread sticking out the bottom. If it's a bit plus or minus from that, I don't care. And we can trim this spring. We didn't do it. We've done this already on a long case clock. I think maybe on the live stream. I can't quite remember. But we can trim the width of this spring to kind of fine tune that if you're willing to fiddle. And that's another good reason not to rivet that pin at the top, because you might want to take it out and cut it down a little bit. Okay, so I don't have an example of one, but on our long case clock, I do have many examples, but anyway, I won't disappear and look for a long case clock. On a long case clock, I haven't got a back cock on it. The back cock slot here is basically, let's just zoom back in. The back cock slot is as thick as the spring. The spring just fits in there, and there's a piece of brass at the top. So obviously this won't work because it can wobble about. Whereas on a dial clock or a fusee clock, let's just have a little bit more exposure. You can see that the slot is quite thick, quite wide compared to a long case clock anyway. And that's because the actual brass top block or the suspension spring fits down in that slot. Now, critically, it's got to be a good firm fit. So it must, here's one I've been making this afternoon. So it's got to be a firm fit like this, so it can't wobble. Otherwise, it's going to affect that rate of the clock. We've just talked about the restoring force. It's got to be fixed. However, it's got to be loose enough so it finds the vertical position when you hook the pendulum on. Otherwise, inevitably, your client will move the clock or they'll rate the clock or something. The suspension spring will end up like this. Then the thing will wobble and it won't keep time. So you've got to find the position where this is a really good fit. And this is I don't have any problem with people buying the spring already made from Cousins or Walsh's or whatever they call their suppliers. But the problem with those springs is the chance of that top block fitting this slot well is like pretty slim. I would have thought anyway. Not maybe the case with the long case suspension, tall case, but certainly with this. So what we want then, we want a bit of spring that joins the top of our pendulum here, like that. Okay, that's the easy bit with our back cock. Okay, connects those two things together. And so I've got two ways of doing it, or two different kind of materials anyway. And that is, you can either start with a solid piece of material. I've got a slightly smarter one somewhere. I've got many pieces of, it's been a lovely afternoon of mucking about with bits of material. So here's a little block of brass. You don't have to use brass. I was fantasizing a few weeks ago about using a bit of Tufnol, a bit of engineering plastic or something. I personally don't think that matters as long as it does the job. I know some people get a bit hot under the collar about that and they'd want to use brass or even yellow brass if you've got an historic, well, all clocks are historic, but a kind of 100, 200, 300 euro clock like this. Anyway, that's up to you. So here's a solid bit. And I'm not going to use this, but I'll just show you what to do. Let's put it in the vise. And you basically need to saw across with a piercing saw. Now my camera's a bit overexposed. Let's get that in the vise. Vici. Like that. So this block is a bit oversized. It's too thick. It doesn't quite yet fit in that slot. And there's a really good reason for that, is that we'll see in a minute when I've kind of demonstrated. So get my piercing saw frame, jeweler's saw, really good tool, essential kit for beginners. And I might have to stand up here because I can neither see nor seesaw. Right, okay. Let's get that so you can see, which is the important thing. So I'm just going to saw across to start with, which is probably quite sort of self-explanatory. However, there's just a bit more to it than that. So I'm going to saw there, make a mark. Get my brass tweezers and then use them to get an equal depth of cut. So you can see I put the saw kind of in line with the block. Then I'm going to put my brass tweezers on and I'm actually pulling up with the saw blade now, and I'm pushing down with the tweezers. And what that'll do is it gives me broken saw blade, but it also gives me a nice even cut across the top there. So
Derek's question about how to work out the length of the spring if they're not later marks.
Well, the only way you can do it is by starting in the middle of the range of, the only way you can do it in that case, if there are no marks, is to start, telling the Team Open Clock Club then, in the middle of the range of what the manufacturer has set. So like on your the 400-day clock, anniversary clock, torsion pendulum, you know, you would set it in the middle of the regulation. It's a different thing here. So again, you'd set the rating note halfway and you would put it so the crutch slot was in the middle of the crutch pin and then go from there on the basis that presumably the manufacturer made it, or the person who made it so it could be adjusted. And that's kind of all I could say really. In terms of thickness that we've just talked about, then that's much more tricky. And again, all you can do is to make one and then say, is this pushing it outside that range, either too thin or too thick? And if it is, then you have to make a thicker or thinner one. But there was an interesting, was it Jane with her suspension spring this week? I think it was. Jane had an interesting question about a suspension spring. She had one that had a hole in it. I'll just do a little drawing. I haven't done a drawing for ages. Well, like a distraction. So I just fit a new piercing saw blade. So here's the spring. You will, here's the top block.
Is the thickness then dependent only on the slot thickness?
No, the slot thickness is, no, don't go by the slot thickness for the thickness. You have to go by the restoring force for the thickness. So if you fit a spring that's where you think in the middle of the range of adjustment by the manufacturer, then if it's losing time, you need to fit a thicker spring. And if it's gaining time, you need to fit a thinner spring. You can't really go by the slot thickness. That's not going to help you if that helps. I'll do a bit more maybe explanation on Facebook as well, just to kind of reinforce this. So here's a suspension spring. This bit here, as you can see, is brass, because it's made out of brass. And then we've got our blued steel spring in the middle. So what Jane had, I think, was a broken spring, and it had evidence of a hole punched in the middle like that. Okay, so the reason for this, I mean, this is kind of interesting. The reason for this is twofold, I think. You've probably seen lots of clocks that have got a double, let's draw another one at the side. A bit thinner this time because I've not got any space in my paper.
Adam says reduce force, question mark.
Reduce force. So you'll have seen a spring like this, either on a mantle clock.
Or the hole. Does it make the spring weaker, Derek says?
Yeah. It makes the spring, exactly. It makes the spring weaker, this effect. But why do you use two blades? And the answer is, because we know that if we increase the width of the spring, and particularly the thickness, but the width, we increase the restoring force. So you want the spring to be restoring force X, or basically as little as you can get away with. I think the people who make those ultra high precision pendulum clocks, today, use incredibly thin and short suspension springs, like metal foil almost. But of course, they wouldn't work in a domestic environment. So the maker has to make the spring strong enough to support the pendulum and also to be used in a domestic environment. So you can increase the strength of the spring, as in the durability of it, but keep the restoring force the same by having two blades like this. Because if the blades are wider, that's the effective width of the spring. But of course, it hasn't got the same restoring force. It's got a great big hole in the middle, a gap in the middle. Now here, you've got a same idea, but a slightly sort of advanced bit of thinking, really, because I think somebody's already said it. It gives you a wider spring, which makes the spring more stable, prevents the pendulum from weaving, but also it focuses the point of flex, or the flexure, around this point here, which is really useful when it comes to isochronism. So we're used to barrel clocks, not fusee clocks. And there's more power at the beginning of the week than at the end of the week. So the amplitude changes and so on and so forth. So it can be really useful when designing a clock to be able to focus the point at which the spring flexes. Because if you think about this one, as the amplitude builds, in fact, as the pendulum goes through its cycle of swinging from one side to the other and back to the middle again, this point of focus actually moves up and down the whole time. So this can be incredibly useful device. So if you see that, the only reason they make a double spring or a wide spring is to give you the same restoring force, but with more width, so the pendulum's got more stability. Hope that.
Is the whole better than the twins then?
It's a different thing. Yeah, I think so. There was a lot of research on this, I think, and Wolfie will know. I think a lot of the synchronome stuff, I might be wrong here, had a hole punched in the spring. Is that right, Wolfie? Yes, I think it is. Anyway, yeah, I mean, if you're designing for the domestic clocks that we work on, TBH doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. But if you ever get into regulators and precision work, then you will find that more and more the hole punched in the spring. And of course, the ultimate sort of development of this idea of the spring being part of the isochronous system in a clock was developed by who? There's your homework, your question. Well, it's not even homework, it's for the end of the thing. So who was it in the 20th century who took the kind of development of the suspension spring to its sort of ultimate point, which maker of observatory regulator clock? Okay, totally forgotten where I was. I was sewing my thing to distract myself from the fact that my piercing saw blade broke. So I've cut a slot. I've got a thicker saw blade now. So I'll cut a slot again. That's the right depth, saw depth. And so if you want to cut this slot neatly, start with a big block of material around it and file down. It's like drilling a hole. Don't make the block to the right size and then try and drill a hole or cut a slot, because it's bound to be a little bit offside. It's a lot easier to work down to something you've already made. So to get it running straight, do it like this. I think I've shown this before. So just start on that slot that you've made there on the corner.
She said, how do you ensure that the top spring holder does not rock?
By making it too big and then filing it thinner and thinner and thinner until it's a really good fit. And as I say, that's I don't have a problem with it, but that's my kind of question about buying them off the peg. I presume they can kind of never really fit properly, but I don't know. I've got a bit of a grim piercing saw situation. I think I was showing off before because somebody was asking me what thickness of piercing saw blades do you use? And I said, I'm just using them up from years and years. In fact, there were some that I got not too long ago that belonged to my granddad. He'll have stolen them from somewhere. And so they were like really rusty ones. So they don't last long at all. Anyway, let's try another one, see if it's actually got some teeth on it. So the point of just demonstrating this is that if you want to saw down neatly, you can't saw down from the top. So again, use my tweezers. There we are. And then I won't spend too much time on this because I'm going to run out of time. But you can see that by doing it that way, you can get the slot neatly down the edge. It doesn't wander off. If you just try and saw down from the top, it's bound to wander off. This bit of material is a bit oversized, as I said, because you want to file down. Doesn't matter how neat your sawing is, even if you're doing it live on camera, it won't, well, the chance of it being on the middle is pretty slim.
David says if you put a piercing saw with an adjustable bar, you can clamp on the shorter length without replacing it each time you break it. That's
a really good point, and that's why I do have one. But because I work quite increasingly off-site now, I don't really actually have a sort of workshop here. So I work increasingly off-site, so I don't forget my piercing saw blades. I taped them to the back of my spares, so I can't use the adjustable one. But you're absolutely right. If you're buying a piercing saw frame, get one like this, I would say. Then you can use the short bits of blade if you're a real Yorkshireman, because we don't like to waste our money. Famous for that. So anyway, enough of that. So you can see here that what I could do is to now begin to saw down from the corners, and I'd have a nice, neat slot. And the reason I've left the block oversized is partly because so you can file the edges and make it neater. But when you put the spring, you imagine we've sewn right down, we get our spring and we put it in the slot in there. What you then do is to hammer this down onto the spring to make it a really good fit. And of course, that makes the outside of the thing hammered. Then you've got to file it down anyway. So there's a bit of a process to be gone through there. However, I'm not going to do it this way with a solid material. I'm going to use sheet material and bend it round. And here's one that I made earlier. I'll show you what to do. It's pretty straightforward. But the important thing here is the kind of material they use. We've talked the whole time through this series of events about different kinds of brasses and different kinds of steels and material manipulation. And I've always said, if you're making something that needs cold working like this does, as bending it, the brass, and it not fracturing, you need to use CZ108, which is like this. I know it's CZ108 because the minute I bought it, I wrote 108 all over it so I wouldn't forget. So this is a plain brass. It doesn't have lead in it. I don't know what the reflection is of. Anyway, I saw the computer screen. but it is not free cutting. So it's a bit of a pig to saw and file and drill. But the beauty is you can bend it. And that's what we need to do here. So when I started this afternoon preparing for this thing, oh, that's CZ108, I had some CZ120, which I've got here. Here it is, look, like this. So this is CZ120. This is leaded brass. And the problem with this is that it fractures when you try and bend it, or when you bend it a lot anyway. And so what I did was I started making one, and I was ignoring my own sort of advice. And I thought, I'll just use CZ120 because it's a lot easier to cut. That's the kind of point of it. It's free cutting. And now this bit's been annealed. I'm not going to do it now. But when I bent it round, it fractured, of course. Then I annealed a bit, and it's still fractured. So I thought, no, I just need to go back to CZ108. So I was quite pleased with that, even though I wasted a bit of time on it, because it did sort of prove that it's worthwhile. Man, fling out and hit me in the face. Knowing this stuff, it's going to work okay now. Typical. Well, that's a good question, Jen. Right, there we are. Thank goodness it worked. Phew, thought I was going to be in a Blue Peter moment there. So you can see this bit of CZ120 has fractured. So it doesn't suit this job. So you have to go through the pin. And Jane, really well-timed question, because the reason I wanted to use this word, the 120, was because it was the right thickness to fit in the slot. 2 thicknesses of this and 1 thickness of the spring. This is 0.7, I think, or 0.8. I've lost my 0.7. Was perfect. So I wanted to use this, but as you can see, it doesn't work because it fractures. You could start with 2 pieces, super glue them together, drill them both, but that's a major faff. So what I did was I moved over to this material, CZ108, sorry. So this is unleaded. And you might think, yeah, how much difference does that make? But the answer is a massive amount of difference, because with this, I'm confident I can bend it over and it won't break. But to answer Jane's question, the problem with this is I only had 1 millimeter. Now filing down from 1 millimeter to 0.7 millimeter doesn't sound like much, but on this sticky material, when you've only got a relatively small bit of material, is a real pain, which is why I did it in advance. But as you can see, so when you're making your spring, cut your piece of material from a sheet, and then bend it round, but just bend it again without it flying up and catching me in the chops. Before you squidge it together, put the bit of spring in, because if you hammer it together without the spring in, you'll never get it in. So let's just get it so far. And get your bit of spring, which is blue steel suspension spring. You can buy this from suppliers. If you get into making your own springs, I would just buy a length of every size you can get. If you can afford it, then you've got it in stock. So that's basically between 0.1, I think, and 0.15. This is, what's this? This is, so that's not quite 0.1. It's about 0.95 of a millimeter. You can see that there. Oh, anyway, 0.95 millimeter. So put your spring in between. Of course, I've closed it up a little bit now. Well, there you go. I'm just saying, don't close it up because you won't be able to get the spring in. Duh. Oh, yeah. So put the spring in between like that. Okay. then you can rivet it down. This has got a hole in it because I was practicing drilling, but it wouldn't normally. You can squidge it in the vise if you want. I've got my big bench vise here, so I'll just speed up the process by doing that. Okay, so there we are. There's our rough top block formed. And what you must have at this stage is it must be too thick to go in the back cork. Doesn't fit. This is answering Devashish's question. You start with it too big and then you file it down, which is all I've done this afternoon. I've got my bit of metal here, like this. Here it is. And just pop that in there. And you can see I filed it to the degree that it just about, it's still too tight, but it just about goes in the slot. You wouldn't want to leave it like this because the pendulum won't hang vertically, but I've got it in the ballpark. Okay, just by filing, and I did that filing, resting it on my trusty cork block held in the vise. You can see the cork block's had a bit of abuse today. And, you know, that's a nice way of holding it as you file. So I've filed it, so it's about the correct thickness. Just a little point about the spring. When you snap the spring off, and I just snapped it off by bending it back on itself, you can see there's a little curve at the end. And the number of times, see that? Yeah. The number of times that you work on clocks and you see this left on and it just doesn't work right and it's all twisted to one side. So when you've got that, I'll just demonstrate here, flatten that out before you fit it into the spring. It's going to make your life a lot easier and it will look a lot smarter. You can maybe cut it in a different way, but just get your hammer and flatten it out. And then when you've done that, then there's still a little burr on here that you can feel. It's not much, but there's a little burr on there. So to do a super smart job, get an Arkansas stone or a ceramic stone or something and just stone that flat. It just makes all the difference to making a neat job.
She says, don't you have to file the bottom to even the two sides?
Yeah, not yet though, not yet. You're ahead of us. You mean here? Yeah, you do. You've got to tidy it all up at the end. But as I said, if you're making anything, don't make the thing and then drill a hole in it or cut a slot in it or something, because that hole will be off center slightly. It's dead easy to drill the hole and then work the edges in. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to drill the hole. I'm going to pin the thing together. Then I'm going to file the edges down to make it neat. Okay, so just use a Arkansas stone, bit of water on it to stone down the edge. That burr on there. Make sure you don't kind of kink the thing up. There we are. So that you can just see where I've stoned off the bit at the end there. And that will make all the difference to this being a successful and neat job. Right, so what I've done here, you can't drill through easily this blue steel. So what I did was I got it in the middle. It's all a little bit tight now, like that. And you can see I started to drill through, and I did that with my Archimedean drill. If you haven't got one of these, they're incredibly useful for this kind of stuff. I don't have a bench pillar drill, regrettably. So obviously you would use that if you have one. But these, they look old fashioned, but they're actually incredibly useful for this kind of thing. So what I did was I drilled through, so you can see, drilled through like this until it made a mark on the blued steel underneath, if you can see that. So when we take our steel out, we can see that mark on the end. I'm going to punch a hole now with my staking set. So let's get Now, I know there'll be people there saying, this is taking ages, why don't you just buy one? And no problem with buying one, as I said before, other than, of course, as a beginner, and that's what we're kind of here for, is that you just learn a massive amount of what I consider incredibly useful processes by doing this kind of thing. And if you've got time, there's that kind of sense of satisfaction. And there are just some situations where off the peg stuff won't work, and you'll come across that. So it's useful to have these skills, I suppose. So this is for beginners. This is a thing called a staking set. It's a watch tool, primarily, watchmaker's tool. You can buy them new, and they're kind of a lot of money. They're $1,000 or something, I don't know. But you can also buy them secondhand on eBay and that kind of thing. And they're really good value for money, absolutely essential when you get into these kind of slightly more sort of advanced, using the word advisedly, repairs. And really useful thing. Now, it's primarily made for riveting, but I'm going to use it here for punching. So I've got a stake here, look, with a flat end. It's got a hole in it, but let's draw a veil over that. I've aligned it with the anvil underneath, and I'm just going to, he says just, without really being able to see what I'm doing. Where's my glasses? Might be actually useful to have a look at this. Get it something like in the middle. And then I think that looks like it's in the middle. Hope so. Then just tap a hole there. I didn't quite tap hard enough. Do it a bit more. Now, if you've got a really smart staking set, I wouldn't use it for this kind of sort of punching the holes in spring steel. Keep it for your nice watch work. So you can see now we've got a hole in the end, pretty much in the middle, yeah. But again, there's a burr on there. So many times I see that burr left in place. So just hammer it down. Then again, get your Arkansas stone and stone off the burr. We'll stone off some of the blue, but I don't care about that. What I'm interested in is making it reasonably smart.
Split stake,
No, you want a staking tool. There are, I think it was Jonas, is Jonas with us today? Who kindly posted on Facebook, he bought this special tool for punching holes in mainsprings, and it's really cool for those big things, but I don't think it goes this small. So no, you want a staking set. And weirdly, they're, well, I suppose they're a kind of a limited flavor, really. They're not massively expensive secondhand, although often some of the stakes are missing, but there you go. No, staking set is the way to do it. So there we've got a hole in. We have now stoned off the burrs. So that, in theory, goes back in there. And if we're lucky, let's have a look. We should be able to drill the whole way through now. This. I won't subject you to the torture of seeing me drill the whole way through. I put it in the vise. In round. So you can see the process here. We do times 55. Yeah.
Yeah, 55.
So you can see the process here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drill through here. I'm going to temporarily put a pin through there. Now, for that, because we're going to run out of time, for this pin here that rests in this V slot, you see that V slot there cut in the top? That pin, don't put a tapered pin in. File it so it's parallel or near parallel. Otherwise, if you just stick a taper pin through there, and you see this a lot on pendulums, what will happen is the pin will only be resting on one side. And if the block's a good fit, it might not matter too much, but often you see it rocking on one side. So get a taper pin or a bit of blued steel that's been let down, you know, annealed, and then file a parallel pin, and that'll fit nicely and neatly into that slot. So I'll keep drilling. Might take a while. Again, this is where your Asiera bench drill comes in handy. So it would be done hours ago. It is working, believe it or not.
Some people use a wood block at the bottom of the punch. What do you think about that?
Yeah, you can do. What I've found with that is that it just squidges it down a lot. You've got to punch a lot harder. Yeah, you could do to punch a hole. If it's thin material, I think with this, you see with my Archimedean drill, it didn't take too long, just several half-lives of something. Anyway, I would just, I mean, it's an expense. I get that, and there's a lot of outlay. But if you buy a staking set on internet secondhand, and you buy one, you know, at a reasonable price and look after it, the chances are when you want to, if you want to sell it, you get your money back. That's a good thing about a lot of these watch tools. They're actually appreciating as more people, not because of we clocks people, but because of watch people. Right, so in theory, yay. Those holes line up now. And if you don't believe me, because I barely believe myself, let's just get a pin. Lost my pins.
Franklin says he also sees clocks with a brass suspension spring. They're Dutch Frisian clocks.
Oh, okay.
Is there a specific difference in performance of the two materials?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I suppose that, Franklin, is a really good question to which I could guess an answer with that. I mean, I think there are some American clocks that have got brass mainsprings, aren't there, as well, which seems kind of counterintuitive, but good question. And I think the answer is yes, because I suppose it's modulus of elasticity of brass is very much dependent on work hardening. So the more you work it, you know, it doesn't harden the same way like carbon steel does through temperature, but through cold forming. So if you want to make the spring more springy and less plastic, then you would hammer it more. So I think the answer is yes, because you could adjust the spring rate of a brass spring, I think, just by hammering it or by annealing it, conversely. Just going to get some thinner pins. Good question, though. So this is just a temporary measure. Just pop a pin through there, just to demonstrate that it does actually go through the hole. Just tap that in. Ooh. You actually want to make the hole in the spring bigger than the hole in the brass. I think I've made it about the same size. It should be a little bit bigger, so I'll take it out and enlarge it a bit, because you can see my pin isn't quite filling up the hole there. I want it to be a bit bigger. And also my point about they don't use a taper pin on these things. You can see that if you fitted this wherever our back cock has disappeared to, there it is, look. If you fitted this in here, although it might actually be a good fit, it's going to be touching on one side. So file, that is actually a really good fit. Super pleased with that. So let's get this. I think we're out of time, aren't we?
A minute.
So what I'm going to do now is to line it up like that so it's nice and straight. Remember, I'm not fixing this yet. As Devashi said, at the end, I need to file the sides down and file it so it's parallel here at the bottom, but that's the very last thing. So the next step is to get our center punch, or I think I just did it by eye last time, which is a bit naughty. Like that. Let's just tap that down a bit more. Yeah, that hole in the spring should have been bigger. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just should get my center punch, but in a rush. So this is going to be a pin that sticks out at both sides. This next hole is going to be a rivet, okay, but it's still the same process. Drill through till it makes a mark, take the steel out, punch a hole in it, drill the whole way through the things, and then we can put a brass rivet through there. So we've still got a bit of work to be done on this. So we'll continue. There we are. I will actually center punch it, but you can see the point here. Start again with my Archimedean drill. Drill through until it makes a mark on the steel, take it out, punch a hole, put it back, then fit a brass rivet. And then we've got this end to do with the pendulum, but that's going to be next week. So it's amazing how many weeks of Open Clock Club you can get out of making one suspension spring. But as I said, it's not really to make the spring. That's not the point, because you can buy them for like, I don't know, $1 or something, I guess, or whatever they are. But the point is to get used to materials manipulation, drilling, hammering, filing, marking, and so on, because inevitably you'll come across a problem with a clock where something's been changed, worn, or broken, and you'll need these skills. So it's easier to go through an exercise like this. Okay.
Jane's tried cutting paper clips to use on a suspension spring.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Because nice parallel soft wire, isn't it? Yeah. Good. And just something else where a paper clip is incredibly useful. I've forgotten now. Anyway, apart from clipping bits of paper together. Anyway, as always, thank you to Team Open Clock Club. I've been typing away and keeping everybody entertained. Thank you for your feedback here. We'll see you again next week for our 41st Open Clock Club, where we'll finally get this finished. I'll progress it to the point where we can just whack this together next week and see, because everybody presumably wants to see the clock ticking. Well, I do anyway. Other than that, see you on Facebook. We are, I think actually next week we'll be back to live streaming, won't we?
Yes.
Right, okay, we've had our live stream holiday, so I think next Thursday we're back to live streaming, and I've bitten off far more than I can chew, because I'm going to start working on an American clock, which I know nothing about, so I'm going to need everybody's help. So you can find us on YouTube on Thursday at 1800 British Summer Time, and I know that doesn't suit everybody, I'm afraid, but it's the best we can do for our live stream. If we don't see you there, see you on Facebook. Thanks again for all your support and help. And if not, we will see you back here next Saturday at 1800 British sometime for the 41st Open Clock Club. So thank you very much, and bye for now. Thank you.